Hello and welcome to today's webinar entitled Understanding and Addressing Criminal Thinking. The two presenters today are Michael Chaple and Joseph Madonia, and we'll be hearing from them soon, and I'll introduce them. Today's webinar is presented by the SAMHSA Gain Center with the support of SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. Before we start our presentations, I'll have some housekeeping to go over, and if you have any questions, please put them in the question box with regard to the technology. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation and discussion do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. We'll be entertaining your questions at the end of today's presentation, so please submit your questions to the presenters in the Q&A pod. The presenters will address as many questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. We also have some polling questions we would like you to respond to. So if you, now that the poll is open, please respond to the questions you can see in the polling pod to the right. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides will be disseminated in the days following the webinar. A certificate of attendance will be available for download at the end of the webinar, and this certificate is for your personal portfolio use only and is not eligible for CEU credits. The Gain Center has arranged for live captioning of today's webinar to enhance accessibility. To view live captioning, select the Accept button in the Multimedia pod located in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. You can change the color contrast of the live caption pod to suit your needs. We recommend selecting the high contrast style for best visibility. As you can see, this is the agenda for today's webinar. I presented the welcome. My name is Lisa Callahan, and I work at the Gain Center, which is located at Policy Research Associates. John Berg will give some comments from SAMHSA in just a moment, and then the presentations from Michael Chaple and Joe Madonia will follow. So I'd like to turn this over to John Berg, who's a Senior Public Health Advisor for CSAT at the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration. John?
Thank you, Dr. Callahan. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Understanding and Addressing Criminal Thinking, an essential component of treating people with substance use and co-occurring disorders in the criminal justice system. We appreciate you taking time to participate in today's informative webinar. SAMHSA is very pleased to present on the importance of addressing criminal thinking when working with individuals involved in the criminal justice system. SAMHSA provides funding for drug courts and reentry programs, encouraging the use of evidence-based practices to effectively treat individuals with substance use disorders and co-occurring substance use and mental health disorders. Researchers have identified substance use disorders as important criminogenic needs that deserve primary focus of most interventions, as seen in drug courts. Criminal thinking is an important component of antisocial cognition, which is one of the big four criminogenic risk factors associated with the likelihood that someone will reoffend. As noted in the National Association of Drug Court Professionals Drug Court Best Practice Standards, Volume 2, understanding the nature of criminal cognition and how it differs from non-criminal thinking and decision-making provides critical insight for criminal justice practitioners as they design programming intended to reduce recidivism among individuals under supervision. This webinar introduces the concept of criminal thinking as a means of describing, understanding, assessing, and changing criminal behavior. Our presenters will introduce emerging cognitive behavioral interventions for criminal thinking, including 3 commonly employed approaches that are designed to address criminal thinking and decrease recidivism by improving social skills development and problem-solving skills, such as thinking for change, and increasing moral reasoning, such as moral recognition therapy, or MRT. And the third is reasoning and rehabilitation. We are pleased to have 2 great presenters with us today, Dr. Michael Chaple and Joseph Madonia. Thank you so much for presenting on this very important topic today. Obviously, a lot of interest as you can see with the number of participants we have today. I would also like to thank the Gaines Center and the staff for their work in developing and facilitating today's webinar. And at this point, I will turn it back to Dr. Callahan.
Thank you, John. I wanted to, before I introduce the speakers, I wanted to give an idea of the poll results, the people who are attending the webinar today. And a large majority of the people are from urban areas, followed by a similar number from suburban and rural areas. The majority of professional affiliations that people selected are primarily probation, and secondly, followed by community-based service providers. We also have individuals from corrections, law enforcement, the judiciary, crisis services, and a number of other professional affiliations represented. So in introducing our speakers, I'd like to first introduce Dr. Mike Chaple. He's an assistant professor in clinical psychiatry at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, which is part of Columbia University. He leads SAMHSA's training and technical assistance initiatives for Region 2, including the Addiction Technology Transfer Center, or the ATTC, and the Opioid Response Network. Dr. Chaple worked previously at the National Development and Research Institutes, which is also known as NDRI, for 20 years, and including as executive director of NDRI's USA's Training Institute. Dr. Chaple completed his master's in criminal justice at the John Jay College and his PhD in criminal justice at Rutgers University. Our second speaker will be Joe Madonia, who is the executive director of the Warner Fund, which is a private foundation that provides grants to small, innovative grassroots not-for-profits that serve children with disabilities and children in foster care. Mr. Madonia is the former project director with the New York State Supreme Court, the Brooklyn Treatment Court, where he was there for 15 years and was responsible for managing all of the treatment court operations and services. In addition, Mr. Madonia is a clinical professor at NYU's Graduate School of Social Work, and he's an executive trainer for many national organizations addressing topics related to mental health and substance use. Mr. Madonia completed his clinical social work degree from NYU and is a New York State credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor. So before I turn the microphone over to Dr. Chaple as our first speaker, I wanted to give a little bit of context in terms of where the webinar information on criminal thinking fits. As we know, the prevalence of substance use and co-occurring disorders is quite high throughout the criminal justice system. For people who are serving sentences, they have well over half have substance use disorders who are serving sentences in state prisons, and around 2/3 of people serving time in a local jail have substance use disorder. People under community correction supervision report much higher rates of misuse and dependence on illicit substances, with people under supervision reporting much higher use than those who are not under supervision. The prevalence of co-occurring disorders has also been well documented in all correctional settings, with 42% of people in state prison, a third of people in federal prisons, and nearly half of people in jails all being reporting having a co-occurring substance use mental health disorder. So as we start to think about where criminal thinking fits into our response to offenders, I wanted to mention the risk-need responsivity approach, and also focusing on the criminogenic factors with antisocial cognition or criminal thinking being one of those. Most of you are probably familiar with the R&R model, but just to give a quick recap of what those are, the R and N and the other R stand for, is that the risk is an approach to match the level of service to the offender's risk of reoffending. That's recognizing that not all offenders have the same level of risk, and it's important to match our response to them is commensurate with their risk to reoffending. The need is the dynamic factors, because these change over time, and this is the R&R requires that we address criminogenic needs and target them in treatment. And finally, the responsivity aspect of the R&R is the ability to maximize the offender's ability to learn from our interventions and to provide cognitive behavioral treatments making sure to tailor the intervention to the offender. Criminal thinking or antisocial cognition are used interchangeably, and this is one of the big 8 criminogenic factors that's been supported in much research. In addition, it's important to emphasize that substance use is another one of the critical 8 factors that needs to be considered when working with justice-involved individuals. We know from research that the R&R approach is successful in reducing recidivism. It improves outcomes for justice-involved individuals. This table on this slide highlights that offender treatment, specifically R&R, when it targets recidivism, has among the highest effects compared to other treatments of other kinds of interventions. In addition, it's important when we talk about treatments and interventions with justice-involved individuals that these interventions are provided with fidelity and implemented with fidelity. We know from the research that when addressing criminal thinking among individuals with substance use disorder, we find a reduced substance use with the use of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, or contingency management. We also have found improved adherence to medication and healthcare visits with contingency management, and improved psychosocial adjustment with relapse prevention, and altogether reducing recidivism. So with that context, I'd like to turn this webinar over to Dr. Mike Chaple.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to the Game Center and SAMHSA for having me here to present today. Initially, I'm going to talk a little bit about the background around criminal thinking, defining it, illustrating it, so that everybody understands exactly what it is, and providing some context for the treatments that will follow that Joe will present on. So I'm not going to read each of these off, but I mean, we all see the news every day, and we all see various crimes being committed, people stealing, people hurting other people, people getting arrested, and we often kind of wonder, what's going on? What were they thinking? We can't possibly understand it sometimes if it doesn't relate to us, and for most of us, the thought of committing these crimes is heinous. It's unthinkable. We may think that they weren't thinking at all. But there's been a lot of research done about this and what goes into these activities and what makes some more likely to offend than others. And we found in general that there are some similar thought processes to this, to these outcomes. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what those thought processes are, what has been culled from the research that has been done on this. So the criminal personality is it's a three-volume series. Yokelson and Samnow were the authors of this series, and the criminal personality is the first volume, which argues that understanding the thought processes of chronic criminals, some call them lifestyle criminals, career criminals, people that are repeat offenders generally over the course of the lifestyle, provides a major key to understanding criminal behavior. Volume 2 in this series, which will get touched upon by Joe in his presentation, though not specific to the volume, addresses the various techniques of therapy that have been developed for the analysis and correction of criminal thought patterns. And Volume 3 addresses specifically the special problems of therapy that are delivered to justice-involved individuals who are chronic drug users. So if this is a topic that you're really interested in, this 3-volume series does a lot to clarify, the thinking in this field. And essentially, in the first volume around criminal personality, the authors concluded that individuals who commit crimes should be thought of as rational actors, not just products of their environment. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of competing arguments in those arenas, but not just products of their environment in terms of their psychological influences, their social influences, family, friends, neighborhood, etc. We really should think to some extent of these individuals as rational actors who engage in a thought process. And this work has served as the basis for criminal thinking theories that have emerged over the years and criminological research that exists today on criminal thinking, as well as many of the interventions that have been developed to address that. And so criminal thinking defined looks at patterns of thought that are believed to perpetuate criminal behavior. And we already sort of addressed, Lisa went over a little bit of this, and John mentioned it in his overview, is one of the criminogenic risk factors associated with the likelihood that someone reoffends is antisocial cognition. And criminal thinking is a major component of antisocial cognition. And antisocial cognition is the belief, attitudes, values of someone that effectively support their involvement in criminal behavior. And so, and what we do know, although I'm not going over an in-depth review of all the research on this, is that these criminal thinking patterns that emerge have been predictive of institutional adjustment. So individuals that are incarcerated in jails and prisons, how well they will adjust to the rules, regulations, and environment of a jail or a prison. Institutional violence that may or may not occur. Non-completion of treatment, so substance use and mental health treatment, as well as recidivism. So these aren't just theories. A lot of what has been put forth in these theories has shown that it does affect the thinking that takes place, does affect the behaviors that follow, which makes it, you know, extremely important that we think about how we can address this in our response to criminal behavior when we think about the interventions we use to reduce recidivism. So there are three components of criminal decision making. Essentially, a criminal lifestyle is the result of choices criminals make. That's one. I have it listed as the second bullet. Although it is acknowledged that choices take place within the limits established by early and current biological and environmental conditions. So the choices we make are not independent of the conditions in which we exist and are exposed to. And then the third component, which is cognition, is the cognitive styles people develop largely as a consequence of their biological or environmental conditions and the patterns of choices they make in response to those conditions. And so I'll go over these in a little bit of more detail, but first I want to provide a little bit of a backdrop in terms of balancing the three C's. And I mentioned this at the outset of my presentation. They're not exclusively two schools of thought in criminal justice theory, but there largely are two schools of thought in criminal justice theory. And anyone familiar with it knows about the classical school and the positive school. And I have a little bit of a comparison here in terms of the major tenets of those theoretical schools of thought. So the classical school of thought largely believes that crime is a choice. It involves the presence of free will. People are, individual actors. They exert free will when they make these decisions. They know the difference between right and wrong. They're rational actors, so they weigh cost benefits of their actions. And in this case, deterrence is a justification for punishment. So when you think about laws that have been created and oftentimes the notion that we need to be more punitive on crime, the logic behind that or the theory behind that is much of what is outlined here for the classical school, that people make the decisions, they're rational actors, and then therefore they have to live with the consequences. Now, the positivist school, in contrast, really looks at the fact that, no, crime is not entirely a choice. Instead of free will being the driving force, environmental influences are most salient in the lives of many offenders. People do not always know the difference between right and wrong. They often vary in their understanding of that because of the way that some of these conditions and factors influence them. There are always limits to rationality. The notion of weighing costs and benefits is unrealistic in many cases, especially in crimes of passion. And then in this case, rehabilitation is the justification for punishment. So we think that, in order to reduce recidivism, we need to provide people with services and we need to intervene in ways that make people's lives better, whether it be substance use treatment, whether it be addressing criminal thinking, whether it be anger management, and any number of interventions that we know have been used, even employment assistance, and et cetera. So I think the takeaway message here really is that neither school of thought alone can explain criminal behavior. So many times with theories, we want to take one side or the other. And the reality is, as I presented on the previous slide, is that choices are made in the context of the conditions in which people exist and the influences that are exerted upon them. And so one should consider the cognitive processes emphasized by the classical school, which a lot of which is illustrated in the various criminal thinking errors that we will address today. But we cannot, in doing so, forget the role of environmental factors that are emphasized and that are present in the lives of many of these offenders. And so the first C that we talk about stands for conditions. So conditions refer to the biological, psychological, sociological factors that increase or decrease the likelihood that an individual will commit crimes. So it includes a consideration of risk factors. So risk factors are things like negative attitudes, values, or beliefs, drug use, drug or alcohol use, or mental illness, poverty, homelessness, unemployment, witnessing violence in the home or community, lack of positive role models, presence of negative role models, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, and we can think of many more. It also considers a risk, also includes a consideration of protective factors. So protective factors are positive influences that can improve the lives of individuals or the safety of a community. They may decrease the likelihood that individuals engage in crime or become victims of crime. Building on existing protective factors makes individuals and communities stronger and better able to counteract risk factors. So examples of protective factors: positive attitude, values, and beliefs, parental supervision, success in school, community engagement, a good group of friends or peers, steady employment, stable housing, strong social support, conflict resolution and problem-solving skills, and the list could go on. So these conditions are considered when determining correctional interventions. But this consideration alone, whether it be, does not explain why individuals with risk factors, those who have risk factors present, do not commit crime, or those without risk factors present do commit crime. It also does not explain why those with lack of protective factors do not commit crime, or those with protective factors do. So it's not, those make it more likely. The presence of risk factors makes it more likely that someone will engage in crime, and the presence of protective factors makes it less likely that someone will engage in crime. But it's not an end-all, be-all solution. We have individuals in all those quadrants that you can think about. The second C stands for choice. So choice is the act of selecting or deciding when faced with two or more possibilities. What are you going to do? In most situations, believe that people have the opportunity to choose between doing what's right and doing what's wrong. And then some might even argue that choice exerts far more influence over criminal behavior than conditions. But again, I would caution to think that we really need to consider both choices that are made in the context of conditions that exist and exert influence. Now, the third C stands for cognition. Criminal thinking errors relate directly to cognition. Cognition refers to the values, beliefs, assumptions, and specific thoughts that facilitate both the initiation and continuation of antisocial behavior. Thus, once a person has decided to engage in unlawful behavior, they have to change the way they think. That's the idea, in a way that permits them to continue to engage in the acts and to justify their actions to themselves and others. So it's sort of like a justification, a neutralization. Similarly, an individual's cognitive thought process can be restructured in order to promote more pro-social thinking. And that's what we think about when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, MRT, and some of the other interventions that Joe's going to review for his part of the presentation. If you Google criminal thinking errors, you can find all kinds of information and all kinds of different typologies for, what would constitute a criminal thinking error. For the purpose of this presentation, we're looking at the Psychological Inventory of Criminal Thinking Styles, which is a survey tool that has identified 8 criminal thinking errors that predict recidivism. So, these are surveys, they have domains, the information has been collected by thousands of offenders and has been looked at in terms of behavior, and, various statistical techniques like factor analysis and whatnot have created these 8 different criminal thinking errors that I'm going to go over with you now and do my best to illustrate what those thought processes mean for many offenders. So cutoff is the first one. Cutoff is when the individual has the ability to eliminate the thoughts and feelings that would stop most people from acting upon antisocial thoughts. So many of us may have antisocial thoughts. Many of us are able to cut them off. Many of us are able to reason or rationalize with ourselves that it's not right, it's not the thing to do. But some people have the ability to cut off those thoughts. The more individual engages in criminal behavior, the more rapidly they're able to activate the cutoff and continue to engage in that behavior. And so you have internal cutoffs, which are processes in which the person has built a case and spent effort to become angry and righteously indignant. It allows them to neutralize deterrents that typically exist for many of us and continue with the behavior. External cutoffs, things like using alcohol or drugs, listening to violent lyrics, playing violent video games. We've often had much debate about what is the impact of that among individuals who commit violence. Again, allow them to rationalize that behavior or to build a more antisocial attitude. And, you know, these cutoffs serve to reduce inhibitions, obscure deterrence, and really they serve to mentally prepare the individual to act on antisocial thoughts. You know, a lot of times the idea is that some people may stop themselves from an unhealthy activity due to their conscience, sentimentalities, fear of getting caught. But you can overcome these inhibitions by a process of corrosion and cutoff. That's what this theory, or that's what this criminal thinking error is getting at. Cognitive indolence. Cognitive indolence has a lot of components, more than I can go over in a short presentation. But the gist of it is that it's generally the avoidance of activity or exertion. And a lot of the literature you'll read really refers to it as mental laziness in a way. It describes a person who lacks perseverance and whose overall approach to life is sluggish and superficial, usually taking the path of least resistance, not thinking much about obstacles or consequences, tend to have excitement or thrill-seeking tendencies. So things that are routine, like school or work, that don't seem to offer immediate reward, you know, strike them as boring, unbearable, or not worth it. They tend to speak in broader global terms as a means of avoiding the accountability that comes with specificity. And so there are a lot of different descriptions, and I can read a couple, but think about the failure to make an effort or endure adversity. Effort means doing what one does not want to do, or not doing what one does want to do. Instead of enduring the adversity of life, they escape into coping thoughts and actions. Adversity is anything that's not going their way, which is seen as a failure to control. And so they don't learn and grow from the experience of difficulties because they don't believe that their life should have difficulties. It's sort of this, you know, that sort of perspective. Poor decision-making for responsible living. They do not use sound reasoning, fact-finding, or consideration of costs, risks, or options. If their pretensions and desires are contradicted by the facts, they don't want to hear them. There's a lack of interest in responsible performance, a failure to assume responsible initiatives, a failure to assume a variety of obligations. And so that really talks a little bit about cognitive indolence. Again, generally summed up as somewhat of a mental laziness. Power orientation. Power orientation is something you'll see a lot written about. Many people who engage in crime see others as either strong or weak. And weak people are considered fair game for conquest, exploitation, or manipulation. Through the power orientation, a person seeks to gain control over their environment and other people. When they're not in power, they feel weak and try to manipulate, intimidate, or assault to regain power. And the zero state is an important component of this. It reflects intense feelings of powerlessness and futility. They worry they will remain powerless, and others might perceive them that way and as weak. Feelings are intolerable and run counter to their view of themselves as powerful. And so this is a periodic experience of feeling like I'm absolute nothing, a zero, feeling worthless, hopeless, and futility. And so you attempt to compensate by regaining power and control. And that's what the power thrust is, a person's remedy to the zero state, where they engage in some type of action, maybe violence, to achieve a sense of power and control over others, you know, constantly needing to feel like they're on top. So discontinuity is another component of this. Many people who engage in crime fail to follow through on commitment, do not carry out intentions, or have difficulty remaining focused on goals over time. And so there are three components of discontinuity. Inconsistency is the notion that there's often fluctuations and contradictions in thought and behavior. So generally, people have difficulty maintaining focus over time because of being easily influenced by events and situations that are occurring around them. Again, their conditions and their context. As a result, they have difficulty following through on maybe what were initially good intentions. So that addresses some of the inconsistency. It's really thinking one way, yet behaving another way. External orientation, it's external rather than internal considerations guide an individual's behavior. So again, this is about your environment, the conditions around you. Actions fluctuate in response to the changes in environment. And really, it's arguing that the environment exerts a greater influence on an individual. And then there's compartmentalization, how a person handles the inconsistency in their thoughts and behaviors. And so you may feel sentimental, you may think one way again, you may feel sentimental for a family member, and then steal their money anyway to buy drugs. And it's really again, how they reconcile the inconsistency in their thoughts and behaviors, and how those external influences, such as substance use, really actually tends to dictate their behavior more than their thoughts and their sentimentalities at times. And many individuals can exercise control of their discontinuity when confined in jail or prison, a lot of the research shows. However, these tendencies become more pronounced once they return to the community, because there are a lot more external influences in the community, or certainly different influences that may have originally landed them in the situation they were in. So that's a major contributing factor to recidivism in the research, this discontinuity people experience. Mollification is when an individual blames their antisocial behavior on external factors to avoid taking personal responsibility. So they can find ways to justify, rationalize, make excuses, etc. It's a common criminal thinking error among perpetrators of sexual offenses. And generally speaking, lifestyle criminals seek to downplay the seriousness of past criminal conduct and current interpersonal conflicts by blaming problems on external circumstances, making excuses for their behavior, pointing out unfairnesses and injustices in the world, or devaluing their victims. So this is another critical aspect, another criminal thinking error. In terms of mollification, there's a theory by Sykes and Matza that addresses neutralization techniques. And this really speaks to many of the justifications that are put forth cognitively. And so this will give you a real theoretical typology of what that might look like. The denial of responsibility, belief that the causes of law-breaking behavior is an influence beyond a person's control: poverty, fears, unstable home life, substance use, mental illness. And again, these may be contributing factors, and they in many instances are contributing factors. But without the acceptance of some personal responsibility, it becomes a lot more difficult to address the behavior. Denial of injury, the belief that nobody suffered an injury, their behavior, though criminal, is not wrong. And so, you can think about probably, in instances of theft, what I did didn't hurt anyone. Nobody knew what I stole or needed what I was stole. Nobody really got hurt. What's the problem? Denial of harm or denial of the victim. Retaliation in some instances is justified if they were victimized first, or the victim deserved to have the crime committed against them is the case in some instances when you think about that particular justification. Condemnation of the condemners, the shift of attention to those who condemn the behavior of people who commit the offenses. So it's really about society. It's about the justice system and the unfairness of what's imposed on them, as well as appeal to higher authorities or higher loyalties. And so it may be something like, a group of friends, a gang that someone's part of, that loyalty to that subgroup, or it could be something more positively focused like a family or whatnot, supersedes loyalty to the larger society and its norms, so it sort of justifies the behavior. Entitlement is another. It's really about the sense of privilege and exemption from the rules that govern society. And so, we think about things in terms of uniqueness, so the belief that they are special or different, granting them permission to infringe upon the right of others. And so they consider themselves to be one of a kind, especially compared even to other unhealthy individuals. They want to be above the rest and stress unique set of circumstances that exist. This enables them to ignore outside input and assert a sense of privilege. Ownership is the idea that there's a sense of ownership to anybody or anything they want to possess. And so if they're looking at it, they want it. It's theirs. If they do not recognize that other people own things, there's not such a thing as theft. They consider themselves to be a decent person with the right to anything they desire. And so that's another issue. Misidentification, perceive their wants as needs, basically. There are things that people want, but we can also perceive them as things that we need, and we know that there's technically a difference between the two. Sentimentality, this is the idea that a person tries to atone or do something good for the bad that they have done to present themselves in a more favorable light. They may express a lot of sentiment, nice words, nice thoughts, but they're not necessarily backed up by responsible, caring behavior. It could be that the people that they love or say that they love are often those that they hurt the most and often easiest for them to control and dominate. And, right there listed on the slide, there are some common forms of sentimentality: embracing religion, interest in theater, fondness for animals, civic or political involvement, charitable contributions, aspirations to give back to the community, which are all positive things, but they may be very active in these activities, but it might also be isolated. They may not practice its principles in their daily behaviors. These activities and whatever may be associated in terms of a belief system do not necessarily stop them from unhealthy thinking or unhealthy activities. Instead, they're really designed to support their self-image as a good and decent person while they still continue to act out. And again, although these are all positive activities, this restructuring of their own self-view often means that they avoid self-examination. And that's a critical point about many of these criminal thinking errors, is that these conditions and external influences are important. They do matter, and they do impact offenders in adverse ways, but it's extremely important at the same time that people are able to self-examine and take personal responsibility, because when it comes to intervention and it comes to a pro-social lifestyle, that's what you have a lot of control over. Super optimism is the belief really that they're invincible. They can avoid the negative consequences of a criminal lifestyle indefinitely. They're never going to get caught. They'll always be successful, even though they have little knowledge of how to be sometimes, because that's not the life that they've lived. They're confident about success in relationships, work, and even when it comes to refraining from crime or substance use. And so it's really, again, just the sense of invincibility that precludes any real considerations of the costs or consequences that are associated, with antisocial behavior. And so in summary, criminal thinking is a pattern of thoughts that serve to perpetuate criminal behavior, a series of justifications, and not, these are cognitive processes, some of which may be very, may not be completely conscious. They may be somewhat more implicit in the thought process. Criminal thinking patterns are associated with the likelihood that someone will reoffend. So these aren't just theories about cognitive thoughts and how those influence offending. But most importantly, criminal thinking and everything that I've presented here is malleable. Antisocial attitudes and values can be unlearned and replaced with more pro-social values. And the question is how, and that's what Joe's going to talk with you a little bit about in this presentation.
For the second part of the presentation, I'll be focusing on 3 specific interventions that are commonly used to address this type of thinking with justice-involved individuals. The programs identified can be implemented across all levels of justice-involved supervision, from correctional settings to problem-solving courts to probation and parole. Please keep in mind that as a result of the COVID pandemic, all treatment programs that we will discuss have been adapted to a virtual platform. I will be reviewing the implementation strategies from an in-person approach. Just to review what Dr. Chaple has been discussing for the past 35 minutes, criminal thinking is often tied to a victim stance, with individuals viewing themselves as unfairly blamed, if not hated, and cast out from society. Everyone is against me, or society doesn't give me a chance, while failing to see how their antisocial behavior may have contributed to their problems. Antisocial behavior can be defined as any type of conduct that violates the basic rights of another person, or any type of behavior that is considered to be disruptive to others in society. For example, intentional aggression, covert, overt hostility, threatening behaviors. These behaviors are fueled by cognitive distortions or irrational thoughts, such as you have to punish people for messing with you or they won't respect you. It's here that the cognitive behavioral therapy attempts to change the way someone thinks about themselves and their environment, which in turn will impact and modify the way they act or behave. When we refer to antisocial behavior, we are speaking of intentional actions that harm or lack consideration for the well-being of others. How do we address criminal thinking? Criminal thinking can be addressed by the use of cognitive behavioral therapy approaches through the use of trauma-informed practices. Let's first focus on what CBT is and how it's applied. Then we'll move into the importance of implementing CBT programs through a trauma-informed lens. CBT is based on scientific learning principles. It's a form of talk therapy, encourages, teaches, and supports individuals, and it provides valuable lessons in assisting people with their negative behavior. It builds on a set of skills that enable an individual to be aware of their own thoughts and emotions and identify and understand how situations, thoughts, and behavior influence one's own action. CBT focuses on changing how a client thinks and acts. The approach is systematic and relatively done in a prescribed sequence of interventions. For example, a prescribed manner, time, and order. It's often found in a manualized curriculum. You must be true to the fidelity of the model and cannot deviate from the structured curriculum. Otherwise, it loses its evidence-based perspective. Using the iceberg analogy really is the easiest way to understand cognitive behavioral therapy and how it's effective. Our behavior is what people see. No one can understand or see the thoughts, beliefs, and values that assist in creating or forming that behavior. Many times our thoughts and beliefs may be faulty and not based in reality. We rarely question these thoughts and beliefs because we experience them so quickly. We call these automatic thoughts. These automatic thoughts help create what we call cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions are thoughts that cause a person to perceive reality inaccurately. The belief is, if we modify or change our thoughts, we can then alter our behavior and action. An example of this, consider the following. We have a situation. A friend of yours passes you on the street without acknowledging you or saying hello. You are convinced that he or she saw you. Your automatic thought then is, they must be mad at me. I always knew they never liked me. I always knew he or she was mean or a disrespectful person. The feeling that's brought up or emerges is you're feeling angry, sad, frustrated, confused, annoyed, and hurt. The behavior as a result of the thought and feeling is you ignore them the next time you see them, and you don't invite them to your next gathering. If we take a moment and stop and think about our thoughts and our behavior, we quickly realize that there could be many reasons why our friend did not stop and say hello. Maybe they didn't see me. Maybe they were rushing to get somewhere. Maybe they were preoccupied with other things on their mind. Maybe they were running late for an appointment. A common question to ask at this point is, what are the facts to support my thought of he or she avoiding me? Are my beliefs based in reality? This slide really outlines the process of CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, very clearly. We experience a situation. How we interpret that situation determines how we feel, which will dictate how we react. Our thoughts can be modified and altered by asking ourselves the question, are they based in reality? Learning how to identify or challenge our faulty thoughts or beliefs will impact how we feel and ultimately behave. Changing how we think or perceive a situation will ultimately result in behavior change. Cognitive behavioral approaches are more structured and directive. CBT approaches consistently appear to be most effective treatment therapy for people with substance use disorders and justice-involved populations. Programs that include a cognitive component are more than twice as effective as programs that do not. CBT treatment approaches must be implemented exactly how it is outlined in the curriculum. Once you deviate from that curriculum, it's no longer evidence-based. When working with justice-involved individuals, it's critical to always work from a trauma-informed approach. What is trauma? Trauma is the psychological response to events when they, 1, are experienced as physically, emotionally harmful or threatening, and 2, have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. Examples of physically and emotionally harmful or threatening can be domestic violence, assault, neglect, isolation. Lasting adverse effects can be intense feelings of powerlessness, constant state of fear or panic, hopelessness, hypersensitivity to one's environment. Keep in mind, if you are an observer or a witness to such events, you can experience trauma. For example, witnessing a family or a loved one being shot or overdosing, witnessing the act of domestic violence, or neglect by a parent or spouse. These are all examples of secondary trauma. It's even possible that individuals may be unaware that they have been a victim of trauma. Always keep in mind, it's not the event that determines whether something is traumatic to someone, but the individual's experience of the event and the meaning they make of it. Trauma happens unexpectedly, the individual is unprepared, and the individual could not stop it from occurring. It's important to note when discussing trauma some of the risk and protective factors that can play a role in the implementation of trauma-informed care. What do we mean by risk factors? Risk factors are circumstances, characteristics, or conditions, events, or traits at an individual, family, community, or cultural level that increases the likelihood that an individual will experience adversity. Examples of this can be low self-esteem, drug and alcohol abuse, poverty, history of criminal justice involvement, homelessness, or early and repeated antisocial behavior. Protective factors related to trauma-informed care. What are protective factors? Protective factors are characteristics, conditions, or events that promote healthy development and minimize the risk or likelihood a person will experience long-lasting, long-term effects of trauma. For example, support from family, friends, and community is huge. A sense of safety at home and school, high self-esteem, a positive self-worth, strong spiritual or cultural beliefs, and effective coping skills. Trauma-informed care practices plays a major role in engaging justice-involved individuals. In fact, it should be essential in treating any client that comes through your doors. Why is it important to increase our understanding of trauma and how it impacts our behavior with the justice-involved population? 1, to avoid re-traumatization. 2, ensure the safety for all. 3, reduce recidivism. 4, to make our jobs safer and easier by learning how to develop or create trauma-informed responses, which will decrease the likelihood of an outburst or re-traumatization. Just some quick stats. According to a U.S. study conducted in 2010, 1.4 million serious violent victimizations were recorded. 14.2% of every 1,000 women, 15.7% of every 1,000 men. The same study highlighted that 1 in 4 women experience intimate partner violence and 1 in 13 men experience intimate partner violence. Taking a trauma-informed approach. A trauma-informed approach to services or intervention acknowledges the prevalence and impact of trauma and attempts to create a sense of safety for all, that's the key word there, for all participants, whether or not they have a trauma-related diagnosis. We call this a universal approach to trauma. The goal is to fully engage participants by minimizing perceived threats, avoiding re-traumatization, and supporting recovery. There's often little or no cost involved in implementing trauma-informed policies, principles. Becoming trauma-informed requires re-examining policies and procedures that may result in participants feeling loss of control in specific situations. So training staff to be welcoming and non-judgmental and modifying physical environments to provide a feeling of safety is a key point here. Providing full transparency of program expectations and clear consequences of noncompliance is critical. No surprises should be had by the offender. 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Realize the widespread of impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery. Recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, clients, families, and staff, and others involved with the system. Respond by fully integrating knowledge about the trauma into policy, procedures, and practices, and resist re-traumatization of children as well as the adults who care for them. So ask yourself, how trauma-informed is your program environment? What do you need to consider? To what extent do the program setting ensure the physical and emotional safety of participants? How safe is the area around the program building? Who is present? What signs and other visual materials are there? Are they welcoming, clear, legible, culturally sensitive, and informative and representational? Are the doors locked or open? Are the first contacts with the program welcoming? The first program component is the environment. Put yourself in the role of the participant and imagine walking through your program from a participant's perspective. What do you see? Is it welcoming? Is it intimidating? Is it safe? If you were a participant, what would your first impressions be of the program? Okay, here are 3 of the most common evidence-based cognitive behavioral treatment programs used with justice-involved individuals. And we're going to go over each of them in depth. Thinking for a Change, Moral Recognition Therapy, also known as MRT, Reasoning and Rehabilitation, also known as RNR. So what is Thinking for a Change? First program we're going to review today that has been proven to be effective with justice-involved individuals. In 1998, the National Institute of Corrections developed the first version of Thinking for a Change. The clinically designed program combines cognitive restructuring theory with cognitive skills theory to assist individuals in the juvenile and adult justice system take control of their lives by taking control of their thinking. Since its development in 1998, Thinking for a Change has gone through 3 revisions or updates and has become the most requested document for the National Institute of Corrections Information Center. Thinking for a Change has been the subject of many studies and has overwhelmingly been proven to be effective in reducing recidivism when implemented with integrity and fidelity of the model. Thinking for a Change 4.0 version is the most recent version available. The curriculum has been redesigned so that individuals in a range of staff roles can facilitate groups. No special level of education or professional credential is required to deliver the program. However, there is a 2-day facilitators training required, which can be found on the National Institute of Corrections website. No charge for the training, however, it can only be offered to staff who are working within the criminal justice system. The focus of Thinking for a Change is on the development and mastery of the 3 skills outlined in the slide. Cognitive self-change, paying attention to the thoughts and feelings that go on inside of us to avoid the kinds of thoughts and feelings that lead us to trouble. So identification. Social skills, behaviors or ability we use in situations that involve other people. How we communicate. Problem-solving skills, skills to help us make better choices. Let's take a look at this slide. So the duration of thinking and frequency of Thinking for a Change. The duration is 10 weeks. The frequency is 2 to 3 times per week is recommended. The length is usually 1 to 2 hours per session. Homework assignments after each session. Homework assignments are really the hallmark of cognitive behavioral therapy. Anytime you're assigning homework or you expect your participant to engage in homework, it's usually because you're doing some type of cognitive behavioral program. Thinking for a Change consists of 25 lessons. Not all can be completed in one session, so a typical delivery cycle may take 30 sessions. It's intended for groups of 8 to 12 and should be delivered only by trained facilitators. Due to its integrated structure, it's a closed group, meaning members need to start at the beginning of a cycle and may not join the group midstream. Lesson 5 is usually a good cutoff point. Most CBT programs recommend at least 2 sessions per week. Thinking for a Change is best delivered between 2 and 3 sessions per week. What I really like about this manualized program is that at the beginning of each lesson, there's an introduction for facilitators that provides, 1, a summary and rationale for each of the lessons, some key concepts and definitions, the objectives of that lesson, and activities and worksheets associated with each specific lesson, and the supplemental material that you will need to complete the lessons, such as charts, if there's any slides that need to be handed out, and what the homework assignment after each session is included. The focus of Thinking for a Change is identifying and modifying cognitive distortions. What are cognitive distortions? Cognitive distortions are ways that our mind convinces us of something that isn't really true. These inaccurate thoughts are usually used to reinforce negative thinking or emotions. Once we identify the distortion and challenge the facts of the distortion, we begin to focus on what we call cognitive restructuring. Cognitive restructuring, identify the distortion, look at the evidence or facts to support these thoughts, examine the evidence or facts to disprove these thoughts, and provide alternative rational explanations to the automatic thought. Here's an at-a-glance view of what a manual of what Thinking for a Change curriculum looks like. Each focus has approximately 7 to 9 activities associated with it. The curriculum is broken down into 4 different areas of focus. First being social skills, and the theme under social skills is working on listening and self-awareness. Second, cognitive self-change. The theme there is on self-assessment and reflection. Social skills, again, the theme there is action-based skills. And problem-solving skills, which are, the theme is strategy-based skills. Lesson structure. Each lesson follows this order. How to provide social skills, how to instruct active listening skills, how to ask appropriate questions, how to give feedback, knowing your feelings, and understanding how thinking controls behavior. Supplemental handouts for each activity. They're really easy to implement and are clearly explained in a simplified manner. The program is written on a 6th grade reading comprehension level. This is sort of what a typical group session structure looks like. At the beginning of session, you're going to review the homework. Second is learn the next social skill. The facilitators introduce and model the new skill. Group members role-play a new skill and receive feedback. Transfer training, contract to practice new skills outside of class, which is the homework. Thinking for a change. Some research studies that highlight the effectiveness of thinking for a change. Bickel 2016 noted that thinking for a change helps participants to develop social problem-solving skills and has been shown to reduce their agreement with criminal thinking errors. Lowenkamp 09 stated 23% of individuals who received thinking for a change curriculum recidivated, compared with 36% of the control group. And Golden et al. Highlighted new criminal offense rates for group completers with 33% lower than for comparison groups. So the program is effective if it's implemented with fidelity. That brings us into the next program that I wanted to talk about and review. This program is called Moral Reconation Therapy, also known as MRT. MRT was founded and developed in the early 1980s by Dr. Ken Robinson and Dr. Gregory Little. It was first used in a correctional setting in Memphis, Tennessee. MRT is now used in over 47 states and 6 countries. MRT is a nationally recognized evidence-based practice, a manualized cognitive behavioral program. MRT focuses on changing criminal thinking, improving decision-making skills, teaching accountability, and improving teaching accountability. MRT is based on two theorists, Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development and Erik Erikson's personality development. Through self-reflection exercises, it assists clients to begin to make decisions from higher level of moral judgment. It also promotes positive self-image and an increased self-esteem. It's a systematic treatment approach that requires active group participation, written exercises, and required homework. The term reconation is not an actual word. Actually, it's a made-up word by the authors. Conation is a term derived from the philosopher René Descartes to describe the point where mind, body, and spirit are aligned in decision-making. Re means to change or alter. Therefore, reconation refers to altering the process of how decisions are made. And that's the focus of the program. Here are some of the areas of focus. Confrontation of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, assessment of current relationships, reinforcement of positive behaviors and habits, positive identity formation, enhancement of self-concept, and development of higher stages of moral reasoning. There are 12 steps of what is classified as a freedom ladder in the program. Each of the steps focus on the bullets outlined on the slide. Each step also has an essence and a stage associated with it. So for an example, in step 1, the essence of step 1 is honesty, working on being an honest person. And that personality stage is the stage of disloyalty. If we jump to step 3, the essence of step 3 is acceptance, and the personality stage is opposition. Many times we function within an area of opposition, and we're argumentative in every aspect of our lives. How do we move through that stage is what that chapter focuses on. So there are 12 steps to the program. Each step requires several assignments to be completed, along with a verbal testimony. It's a peer-led, facilitator-supervised group. Peers decide who moves to the next step after assignment presentation and a verbal testimony. The facilitator is only there to oversee the group, ensure that the group rules are being followed, and to oversee the voting, that it's fair. According to MRT theory, most or all of our justice-involved clients base their decisions in the pleasure versus pain or back-scratching stage. The goal of MRT is to help clients make better decisions by raising their level of moral judgment to approval seeking, the law is the law, and hopefully social contracting. MRT program attributes. Open-ended, you can use it across systems, encompasses a range of learning styles. Drawing is used a lot. It comes in multi-language audio versions as well. It utilizes an inside-out process. There's a standard curriculum providing facilitator structure and accountability, emphasizes feedback and student reflection, enhances personal problem solving and self-direction, and helps clients identify their unique strengths. MRT group process, designed to be completed by the average client in 20 to 30 sessions. Completion is when the client successfully passes MRT's 12th step. MRT is specifically designed for clients with open-ended groups where participants can enter at any time and work at their own pace. Clients very rarely move through the steps without struggle. MRT recommendation is 2 to 3 times per week. And one of the great aspects of this program is that it is open-ended. The book is extremely detailed and expectations are clearly outlined. One note to highlight here when conducting an MRT group: clients are not permitted to use victim statements. Although many have been victims of crime, the program focuses on what the offenders have done to others, not what has been done to them. Each step in the program involves completing specific assignments and reporting on how they complete the step. The program is culturally neutral and gender sensitive. Standardized curriculum and facilitator training ensures consistent program delivery and quality assurance. Another unique approach to the development of this model is the way the book has been written. During the development, the authors felt it crucial to have former or current offenders take part in creating the language of the book. The thought being, if offenders could identify or relate to the language in the book, the more likely they will be to be engaged and take ownership of their assignments. It's language that they are familiar with. And MRT is also offered in, they also have a trauma-specific group, Breaking the Chains. I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. I'm going to just read through maybe 1 or 2 bullets on some of the research. People who received MRT had a recidivism rate that was approximately 2/3 of the rate of those who received no treatment. MRT reduced recidivism by 33%. Over 1 million individuals have been treated with MRT. Programs are used in 47 states. I'm going to skip over some of this. Okay, final program we're going to review today, the Reasoning and Rehabilitation Program. Thinking Straight, which is a document edited by Ross and Ross, is devoted entirely to the research on reasoning and rehabilitation. It summarizes the R&R model and program delivery. There are several research studies available on R&R. Also known, R&R has been developed specifically for justice-involved individuals and populations, and it's widely used in Canada, UK, and Spain. The program was developed by Canadian researchers Ross and Fabiano in 1985. They put forth that there are developmental delays in offenders' cognitive skills that are necessary for social adjustment. Similar to MRT, R&R is based on the theory that offenders suffer from social and cognitive deficits. However, R&R does not focus on moral reasoning. The aim is to enhance self-control, cognitive style, and interpersonal problem skills. Quickly, Reasoning and Rehabilitation was developed to focus on changing the impulses, egocentric, illogical, and rigid thinking of individuals committing an offense. Teaches to stop and think before acting and consider the consequences of behaviors. It's designed to assist individuals in more effective problem solving and coping skills, aims to reduce recidivism by addressing and attempting to treat the issues that led to individual committing criminal acts. The R&R rehabilitation program is comprised of 35 sequential models to be delivered of 6 to 8 individuals. 10 of those models contain cognitive skill building sessions. Sessions are composed of group discussions, audio-visual materials, games, puzzles, etc. R&R is a closed group, and frequency recommendation is 2 to 3 times per week. No training is needed to implement the program. No educational level is required. Due to R&R being a Canadian proprietary program, no images of the actual program curriculum were available. But it's shown great results and has only been used in a few U.S. states. Skip a little of this. This is our research that you can go back to. Okay, so additional resources that are commonly used in criminal justice settings: motivational interviewing, the Change Company, which is an interactive journal program, problem-solving skills in action, and aggression replacement therapy. Just a quick note about ART, as it's known. ART is comprised of 3 components. There's a social skills component, anger control training, and a moral education component. And the training is designed to instruct offenders in self-control by having them record anger experiences, identify triggers, thoughts, and apply anger control techniques. Moral education exposes offenders to moral dilemmas in a discussion format aimed at advancing the level of moral reasoning. So that was really a quick overview of the 3 most common programs that are used in criminal justice today, and here's some additional ones. Definitely read up on the research that I didn't have a chance to go through due to time. I'm sure you'll find them really interesting. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left in the webinar, and I will try to highlight as many questions and have our speakers respond to them to the extent that I can. We have a lot of interest and a lot of questions. And so I'm going to choose some from the beginning of the webinar so that Dr. Chaple can respond to those, and then ask some that were asked during Mr. Madonia's presentation, if I think that's about the fairest way to do this. So, Mike, there was a question with regard to whether or not the classical school for understanding criminal behavior, how that can be sort of balanced with and understanding what influence it might have on racial justice, given the disproportionate number of African Americans who are in the criminal justice system.
Yes, I did see that question, and I'm just pulling it up now so I can make sure I see how it's worded. The classical school of thought has had a huge influence on our criminal justice system. Probably there's nothing that even really comes close to it, because what the classical school of thought is the notion of punishment. And so what you would think of over recent decades as get tough on crime, the war on drugs, and many other things that have disproportionately affected African Americans, that's really based in large part on the classical school of thought and the notion that people are rational actors and exercise free will. And that's those laws and that get tough approach to crime is based on the notion of deterrence. If you increase the certainty of apprehension, the severity of punishment, and the swiftness of punishment, you're going to deter people from committing crimes. And we know that that's largely, there's very, very little evidence to support the notion of deterrence. And so the classical school of crime has really driven justice policy for decades now. And we could think of so many examples of get tough approaches to crime, which again, as I said, and as we know, has disproportionately affected minorities and African Americans in particular.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to ask you, Michael, if you could address another question. I know you have access to these. Since laws are socio-political constructs, you know, really addressing the change over time of who's considered an offender and how that fits into this perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer some more clarification on that question, though I know that that's not really an option in this format, or it's not easily achieved. I mean, I think that's a case sometimes. I think there's certainly, I think one example of that would be the war on drugs and drug policy in this country. I think that's a classic example of that. And so I think, you know, and then there's other laws and there's other crimes that are legislated that there's more uniform agreement on and that aren't as much a construct of our socio-political context. And so I can say that. I don't necessarily see the question in the statement, so I'm not sure where to go beyond that.
Some of the questions are being answered in real time, so as you're looking through that for the people who are on the webinar. And I also wanted to let you know that we will be sending out a question and answer information sheet at a later date once the webinar has concluded, and we'll also be sending out the slides. That was a frequently asked question. So Joe, Madonia, I'd like to ask you, how can you ensure that facilitators deliver programs, the various programs that you were discussing, in a non-judgmental way? And how to, I think as part of that, how do you engage the participants into the program and not make them feel as though they're being punished, but instead that it's therapeutic?
Well, let me just say, I mean, when I was able to utilize this program within the drug court world, we sort of used it as an incentive as part of the court, allowing the clients to sort of, you know, make their own choice if they wanted to take part in MRT or not. There is going to be some type of resistance. I think that's normal. And I think taking a sensitive approach and being trauma informed when sort of admitting new people into a group is really critical. And, you know, SAMHSA has some great guidelines on how to sort of create a informed program environment from the type of signs that are around in your group room. Are they culturally diverse? Stating, you know, group expectations, what the rules are of the group, being able to sort of review the rules at the beginning of each group session also ensures structure and sensitivity when implementing these programs.
Okay, thank you. And I'll address this question to either Michael or Joe. I think this is one that probably many on the webinar are curious about, and that's, how do you get different providers and different programs to adopt the evidence-based programs that you've been discussing today?
You want to take that, Joe, or?
How do you get them to adopt? You know, I think most of the evidence-based programs, and I can speak of MRT specifically, they actually provide support. And they will actually come out and explain the program to you. They will do fidelity trainings with you. They have sort of a 24-hour return policy where if you do have a question regarding the fidelity of the program, that you can just give them a call or shoot them an email, and they will respond back to you within 24 hours. And I think these are programs that are really known within the field. And, you see them at many of the conferences that we attend as providers. And, just reading up on the research and the evidence, I think that should be sort of a motivator to learn more about each of those programs.
Okay, another question along those lines is whether or not either of you could recommend or are aware of any of the evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapies that have been validated as being culturally sensitive, or in particular recognize the disproportionate representation of African Americans in the criminal justice system.
Mike, you want to take that one?
I think, CBT in general is one of the evidence-based practices for substance use disorders and has been used widely, and it's broadly constructed in terms of its application in a variety of populations. Validated is something that's a little bit more technically, it's a little bit more of a technical exploration in terms of, assessment tools and other types of things. But there's a lot of research out there, on the application of CBT with a variety of populations in a variety of settings, whether it be criminal justice or not. I'm not an expert on MRT specifically. I don't know, Joe, if you know if there's been any studies that have looked at that intervention in particular.
I mean, all three of the interventions that I spoke about were all first developed for the prison population. And as we know that there is a disproportionate number of Black and brown people within our correctional system. And specifically with MRT actually engaged and recruited the offenders within the Memphis, Tennessee prison system to help sort of create and author the material in the book. And they played a huge role in how the book was actually written and what language was used in the book. Many times, and I'm an MRT facilitator, many times when I'm first introducing the book, I sort of have to let people know that, the language is directly geared for a specific population, because sometimes clinicians or facilitators, are taken back as far as how the book is written.
Okay, thank you. There were a couple of other questions about MRT, Joe, and since you are a facilitator, one question was how does an individual need a clinical diagnosis before being referred to MRT? In other words, being assessed by a clinician, and whether or not MRT should be recommended for most people who are in treatment, justice-involved individuals.
Yeah, you do not. They don't need a formal clinical diagnosis to enter into MRT. MRT takes the perspective that most of the clients that we work with have some, if not all, characteristics of antisocial personality disorder, and the book is really geared towards that. And as far, what was the second question, Lisa? I'm sorry.
Whether they needed a clinical diagnosis, and if there are, if most justice-involved individuals could benefit from MRT. Right.
So again, I can speak from personal experience, just because I've facilitated MRT groups for 15 years during my time at the court, and we had about 3 different groups running at one time, and I've actually seen the changes within someone who's gone through the program. So speaking about MRT, I know it works because I've done it, and I've seen the results. I think it's a great supplement to any type of treatment that someone is receiving within the criminal justice field. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely say MRT is great at teaching clients to take take accountability, change their thought process, and develop pro-social behaviors.
Okay, thank you. Another question, I think this is one which either of you would be able to answer, and I don't think that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer, but the vast majority of programs ask participants. This would be true for individuals on probation or parole or participating in a treatment or diversion, treatment court or diversion program, to attend multiple sessions of treatment, and wondering how they're expected to balance that with the other demands that are on their time, that have families, jobs, curfews, transportation, et cetera. How do they prioritize a program such as MRT?
You need to be a really good clinician and in helping them balance that. You know, if their treatment plan is overwhelming or is heavy, then as a clinician, I think it's your responsibility to really look at the client, look at the client's needs, look at the treatment plan, and really help prioritize what's most important first.
Okay, thank you. Okay, scroll with a lot of great questions, and we will, as I said, we will create a question and answer document for those questions that we left on the table and the ones that were answered. And this is something which, Joe, you spent a lot of your presentation talking about trauma and using a trauma-informed lens and having trauma-sensitive practices. How can inmates prosper from MRT, and I would add other CBTs, without first addressing and healing from their past traumas?
I think the first step in any type of treatment is to create a safe environment. And that's one of the first steps in creating a trauma-informed care environment, is safety and transparency. There should never be any type of surprises. It should clearly be outlined what your role is, what the expectation is, what the consequence is for not fulfilling that expectation. Now, if someone is struggling or in the midst of sort of struggling with a trauma, then maybe beginning MRT at that point, for example, may not be the best approach. And what I didn't get to emphasize that I think is important too is MRT has a separate version for trauma. It's called Breaking the Chains. And it's they have gender-specific workbooks also. So maybe they start off with the trauma version of MRT and then move to the sort of general version.
Okay, thank you, Joe. And Mike, did you have any further comments to add? I'm going to wrap up the webinar in just a second if there are no other comments that you would like to make.
I would just say in relation to the last question, because we know that trauma, the incidence and the prevalence of trauma in justice-involved populations is extremely high, over 80%, if not higher, that has to be, part of any service that's delivered. And sometimes it's touched upon in the context of other evidence-based practices, but there are also trauma-specific interventions that can be utilized as well that aren't necessarily about criminal thinking, that are specific. So it's something that we can almost assume, that's present. Not only trauma-informed care is not a trauma-specific intervention, it's just a way of providing general services in a trauma-informed way, to be cognizant of the fact that many of the recipients have been traumatized. But there are also trauma-specific interventions that can be added to the toolbox. That's useful. Okay, thank you, Dr. Chaple and Joe Madonia, for all of those responses to the questions and for your information and very informative webinar. We were asked by a number of individuals whether or not you would be able to have the questions answered that were left on the table. And as I mentioned, yes, we will create a question and answer response sheet that we'll distribute along with, as well as the slides. For those of you who want to download a certificate of webinar attendance, just as a reminder, these don't qualify for CEUs, but it is just for your own personal portfolio.
to certify that you did in fact attend this. And Amelia is opening a window in the webinar, which should shortly list the file that you would download. You just click on this and download it, and it should you should be able to print that out or save it electronically for your own portfolio. While that window stays up, I'll move this over. For those of you who are interested in learning about more webinars and other technical assistance that the GAIN Center provides, you can join our listserv. And here is the link to that. I don't believe this is a hot link. I think you'll have to put it into your search engine. But this is where we announce not only webinars and other technical assistance that the GAIN Center provides, but also with many of our partners who we work with in other national organizations. So here would be the information for the listserv. And let's see where I can move this to. Here is the information of how to reach SAMHSA and how to reach the GAIN Center, both their website and ours, and also the telephone numbers. And finally, here are Mike and Joe's contact information, both their affiliations and also their email addresses in case you would want to contact them directly. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their attendance and especially thank the speakers for the time and effort they put into presenting such an informative webinar today. Also, I see there's another poll on here, and if there's some additional technical assistance that you might find helpful, if you would answer that poll, and which area would you like additional information on regarding this topic? So if you're interested in getting more information, please respond to the poll, and we will take that into consideration as we're doing our planning. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Have a good day.
Thank you.